So I thought it'd be interesting to make a comparison of the two 454s that were offered in the 1970 Caprice, the LS4 and the LS5 V8. This information comes from the American Manufacturers Association specifications for passenger cars, which was an organization that compiled a lot of statistical information from each of the automakers about their vehicles. And this particular iteration of the publication talks about all the full-size Chevrolets you can see here with their various model numbers. Chevrolet offered many different engines and transmissions in their full-size lineup. You can see here everything from a one-barrel, 250 cubic inch six-cylinder at the top of the page, making 155 horsepower and 235 pound-feet of torque, all the way up to the LS5 454 V8 making 390 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. There were also several small block engines offered, two 350s. The base 350 you can see there, 250 horsepower, 345 pound-feet of torque. This was a low compression two-barrel engine with 9-to-1 compression. And then also a 350 four-barrel high compression engine producing 300 horsepower, 380 pound-feet of torque. They also had a 400 cubic inch, this is the small block 400 cubic inch V8 with a two-barrel carburetor, and it made 265 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque. So if you wanted kind of torquey performance but on regular gas, that was the motor that you got, although I have driven the 350s in this car and they run excellent as well. So all really good choices from Chevrolet for the powertrains. Now turning to some of the specifications, you can see here that the Chevrolet 454 had an over-square design, which means that the bore was greater than the stroke. And the bore of the 454 was 4.251 inches, and the stroke was 4 inches. And you could also see, by the way, in the column to the left of that the small block, particularly the 400, had a very over-square design, 4.125 inches by a 3.75 inch stroke. Over-square designs are popular in higher RPM engines because you can often have a larger combustion chamber, larger intake valves, and you have less stress on some of the engine internals. However, they can also be less efficient because it's harder to promote proper fuel mixing in such a large combustion chamber. And so what you often find on many newer engines is they're actually under-square designs. Now, within the stable of General Motors big block engines, there were both under-square and over-square designs. The Chevrolet, as I mentioned, was an over-square design, as was the Buick V8, even more extreme in terms of how over-square of a design it was. It had a 4.3 inch bore and a 3.9 inch stroke, so even more extreme than the Chevrolet V8. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you had the Pontiac and Oldsmobile 455s that had undersquare designs, with the Oldsmobile V8 being the most undersquare of all the General Motors big block engines. And the Cadillac 500 was an even square, I guess you would call it, design, 4.304 inch bore as well as stroke. Now, one of the great things about the Chevrolet 454 compared to a number of other big block engines of the era is its forged steel crankshaft, which you can see was part of the 345 and 390 horsepower 454 V8. Even the more over-square Buick 455 V8 design had a nodular iron crankshaft. And here we come to the principal difference between the 345 horsepower LS4 and 390 horsepower LS5, and that is the camshaft timing. You can see that on the 345 horsepower version, at the top right there, highlighted in yellow, whether it's the intake valve when it opens or closes, exhaust valve when it opens or closes, and the duration of the opening, that the 390 horse LS5 has significantly longer duration on the intake valve side and on the exhaust valve side, meaning the valves are staying open for longer, letting more intake air charge in or more exhaust air out, and providing greater performance even for the same displacement V8. One other difference you can notice is slightly below the highlights, you'll see intake valve lift of 0.3983 inches for the 345 horsepower engine and 0.4614 inches for the 390 horsepower version. And below that, in the exhaust section, you can see exhaust valve lift of 0.43 inches in the 345 horsepower engine and 0.48 inches in the 390 horsepower version. So in addition to the longer camshaft duration, so the valves are staying open longer in the 390 horsepower version, they're also opening a larger amount and a pretty aggressive amount in the 390 horsepower LS5 V8. And I would just let's keep these values in mind and focus on the intake and exhaust valve duration as we examine another General Motors big block V8 from 1970, the Oldsmobile V8. So we'll just take a look at this for comparative purposes. So remember the 280 degree intake valve duration and the 318 degree exhaust valve duration as we look at the comparable values for the 1970 Oldsmobile 455 V8. So here's the same page out of the AMA specifications for the 1970 Oldsmobile 98. And you can see that for the 455 that was included in that vehicle, the intake duration was 258 degrees as opposed to 280 degrees for the LS4 454. And the exhaust valve duration was 272 degrees as opposed to 310 degrees for the LS4 454. So in other words, the valves are staying open for a shorter period of time on the Oldsmobile V8 than they are even in the LS4 345 horsepower Chevrolet 454 engine, and way less amount of time than the LS5 390 horsepower 454. So while these engines, the Chevrolet 454 was rated at 345 gross horsepower and the Oldsmobile at 360 gross horsepower ratings were rather dubious during the time, and really until SAE net horsepower ratings came into play in 1972, where the engines were rated with the exhaust systems and all the accessories included. Those net horsepower ratings are quite reliable to go by, whereas the gross horsepower ratings are, I would say, a general suggestion in terms of how much horsepower the engine produced. I would argue that based on the statistics and information in these AMA specifications, that while the gross horsepower of the LS4 454 was less than the Oldsmobile 455, it probably performed better, not only because it was in a lighter car, but also because it likely made more net horsepower. And you see that as you go into 1972, that the Chevrolet 454 produced more net horsepower than the Olds 455 and a number of the other GM big block engines. Thanks for watching this bonus footage technical specification video. Let me know how you like it. And please subscribe by clicking the circle icon with the picture of the 67 Riviera in it below. Over 80% of you are not yet subscribed. Please subscribe and like this video, and I'll continue to make more. Once you hit the subscribe button, be sure to hit the bell to ensure that you're notified when I post new videos. Thanks again.